Hello and welcome to DigFin VOX, Voices in Digital Finance. I'm your host, Jame DiBiasio. If you enjoy the program, give us a like, share, subscribe. My guest today has had feet in both the traditional finance world and startup land. Shameek Kundu was Group Chief Data Officer at Standard Chartered in Singapore before joining an AI firm called TruEra. Following TruEra's sale to Snowflake, Shameek is now on his own, and he spoke with me about the trends he sees in AI and particularly GenAI's massive impact on both institutions and startups. Shameek Kundu, welcome to DigFin VOX.
Thank you very much for having me here, Jim.
It's my pleasure. We've known each other really since the early days of DigFin, when you were Chief Data Officer at Standard Chartered Bank in Singapore.
That's right.
After that, you then joined the startup world. You went to an AI shop called TruEra,
Yep.
and now you've left that, and we can get a little bit into the personal story as we go. But I think because of your experience both within a major global bank as well as your experience in the startup world, working with data, machine learning, and other types of AI. I think you bring just a huge wealth of experience. And now that you're a free agent, hopefully you can share some of what you've learned to our audience. So that's why I'm excited about this conversation. So let's start. You went from being in a big bank with a big role to becoming somebody in the startup world. Just talk us through what that was like. What made you decide to go into the startup world, and just that experience both professionally, but also just personally at the human side.
Yeah, maybe I'll do it with a few numbers. 2,500 was the size of my direct team when I left. I have and had 0 people in 3.5 years reporting to me. So that's one
That must have
contrast.
been very nice.
That was absolutely brilliant. Absolutely. I've sworn off managing people as a result. 500 million spending, which was difficult, but not that difficult. Other people's 500 million to earning even the first million. Very different ball game, right?
Yeah, that's
And
hard.
then, of course, 150 years of history versus when I joined, literally the first year, but even till its full life, less than 5 years. So I guess these give you some indication from a numeric perspective how different it was. But yeah, I think very different experiences, bringing very different skill sets and very different value to me as an individual, to anybody else who attempts it. I mean, if I were to characterize the big differences, there is the experience and the and the and the satisfaction of having broad directional impact at scale. That's
Hmm.
how I would take my role at Standard Chartered, but also any other person in big companies. Most of us, at least, are broadly having good impact in the right direction. But individual targets, unless you're a salesperson, yes, there are many individual targets, but it's very difficult to say I have achieved success if I've done these 3 things. You have to kind of really focus on moving the tanker in that direction.
Right.
Whereas in a startup, it is much more about very concrete. Here is the product, or here was the product till I pivoted, and here's the targets that are not targets by company, but here's the target industry that I'm going after. In this case, B2B software, and achieving that kind of adoption. Or if it's user based, then it's a number of users. So I think the specificity and the narrowness of the role, in many ways, for me personally, was very satisfying because it helped me see the impact of my work much more in front of me. The other big difference, but that is to be expected, is of course it's a much smaller organization. I was employee number 18, and you could do stuff far more quickly, far quicker, and a lot of it was up to you. You didn't have to take a lot of other people with you, but equally you couldn't bank on a lot of other people helping you get there. So I think these were 2 big differences. I wouldn't say one is good or bad, but certainly at this stage in my life, I did have a very, very good time with the startup after many years of working at a large organization.
And what would be some, for people who are still in traditional finance and might be thinking about startup life? I think a couple of years ago, there was a big wave of this. I don't know if that wave is still continuing, but I do still meet people who sometimes look over the fence with envy. What are one or two lessons or suggestions that you would give to people who are in TradFi, working at a large institution, who are thinking about fintech or any kind of technology startup?
Yeah, you asked me whether I see people looking at it with envy. I don't know about envy. I don't think it's envy, but curiosity is very strong, and it's been one of my best ways of doing business development because people wanted to speak to me more to understand what that journey was like. And then, of course, we got talking about TruEra and the company and so on. So yeah, what would be my advice? My main piece of advice is don't go anywhere because you want to join a startup, right? There are a lot of reasons to not want to work in TradFi. And those reasons, at least in my case, when I joined the startup, it was true. Those bad things, if you will, did disappear. The bureaucracy, if you want to call it that, the politics, the need to have multiple stakeholders, all those do go away. But it's really bad to do something because of the absence of something.
Hmm.
You should join a startup or another company or start your own thing because you want to do something, not because you're running away from something. I know it sounds cliched, it's not unique to financial services. But in my case, it was a very specific thing I wanted to achieve, which was to try and drive responsible adoption of AI, in this case in financial services, but could have been broader. If you have something like that, I don't know, expanding wealth management access to certain markets or opening a new kind of line of business altogether or serving clients, if you have that mission in place, go ahead with a startup, your own, other people's. But
Yeah.
don't do it because you're tired of your day job.
Yeah, right. Okay, great. So let's talk about TruEra then. You were talking about you wanted to make AI, safe and usable for enterprises. So give us a little bit about, when you came into TruEra, what was going on. My understanding very broadly is using machine learning or using tools to make the machine learning work better. So just talk us a little bit through what that was like, and as a startup, how did that go?
Yeah, you're absolutely right in the way you characterized it. It was using tools, and until very recently, it wasn't more AI. It was non-AI techniques to make machine learning more reliable. So that's what it was for a long time until generative AI came in when we had to start using AI to test AI. That's a different thing. Yeah. So first of all, what did TruEra do? It provided software, so not services, but software that enabled companies to test, debug, and monitor their machine learning systems, and more recently, their generative AI-based systems. That's what it did. Provide a software to enable people to test and monitor. But if you ask me how did that journey go, I think initially we came at it much more from a risk perspective. We came at it from how does the risk of using AI, particularly in regulated industries, get managed very well. What did that mean? It meant that you would target, at least initially, either very senior people who are worried about the impact of adoption of AI in their organization in terms of blowbacks, etc., or second line risk management kind of people, right? And that was great to get initial senior traction. But very quickly, it reached the stage like, well, actually, the people who really need to adopt this are those who are building the models and who are using those or productionizing those systems. So from, hey, this is a great way of preventing bad things from happening, to this is a great way for you to build really good quality, productive, effective, reliable AI-enabled systems. That was the first shift, right? So yeah, I would characterize that as shift number one. It took us some time, but we did that. The second shift was the time in the life cycle. We started off with, hey, you're only here to test whether this thing will work. We realized that doesn't work, certainly not in machine learning or more broadly in AI. You keep iterating on it. So we moved from upfront testing to ongoing monitoring of how this system is doing. That was also good for our revenue model, of course, because that meant we would have more steady streams. The third big stream was, of course, the shift to generative AI. That wasn't our shift, it was industry around us. Now,
Right.
until then, there was a lot more focus on really being able to explain what's going on inside the black box of kind of traditional predictive models Um, but with generative AI, that became more or less impossible, or not really worth it. Understanding the weights of a neural network, yeah, okay, but what does that tell me? So it shifted much more to never mind how it is working, but can we assure that it is working reliably,
Yeah.
right? So it became much more about that aspect. So these are some of the shifts that happened in the market, and in parallel, it's not just us. The overall market of AI adoption also moved from something which was reasonably niche, and you had to cross a very high bar to make sure that it all worked, to something that is now much more accepted as something that will be done, and you're looking for ways to do it in the most effective and reliable manner.
So I got two things I want to follow up with that. The first one is going back really to your first point is for a bank or an insurance company or an asset manager or any kind of institution like that, uh, to be able to use these things well, to be able to even understand what a company like TruEra was trying to bring to them, uh, what level of sophistication do they need around having rules around data governance? How advanced of an infrastructure and a systems architecture do they need to be able to, I guess, see data from different silos and match that into something that makes sense?
Yeah. So I think ultimately, I always said TruEra was a derivative product. It didn't have any value on its own. It only had value if you were already using AI, and for something that I think one of my advisors used the word in anger, meaning you are genuinely using machine learning, or more recently, generative AI to do real stuff. If all you were doing were playing around and doing some pilots, there was no need for having a sophisticated system to test and monitor it. So the first precondition was not even about data. It's like, do you actually have adoption of AI in areas that matter? And that indeed depended very much on all the things you mentioned, the maturity of the data, the systems fragmentation, etc. And I would say my rough rule of thumb is about 10 to 20% of the traditional financial institutions were actually at a level where they could do serious stuff with machine learning, right? No more than 10 to 20%. Now, that 10 to 20% absolutely got what we were about. And their challenge to us was not, we don't understand what you're doing. Their challenge to us was, how do you take what you've got and make it an integral part of our workflow and our systems? For the remaining 80 to 90%, indeed, for a very long time, the challenge was even explaining to them what we do, because well, we haven't even figured out how to do machine learning models that in any area that matters. Why would I worry about testing it,
Yeah.
except to tick the box on ESG? Now, this changed, though. I'll just finish off with that. This changed dramatically in the last 6 to 12 months. I mean, in the week that we were acquired, we had 4 new potential clients coming in. And that was because suddenly the point about how AI is inherently unreliable was very obvious to everybody with generative AI. So suddenly the adoption of software to test and monitor it became much easier. But
Yeah.
for the most part of our journey, not that easy.
Okay. We'll get there. But just on this last point, that 10 to 15% of institutions who are sophisticated enough to actually deal with these levels, uh, is it right or wrong to assume that that sophistication correlates with their size and budget? Um, is it lazy just to think that those institutions are sort of like the 20 biggest capitalized banks, or uh, are there more nimbler institutions that may not be considered tier one, at least at a global level, but who are also quite good at this? What demarcates a bank or
Yeah,
other institution that's good at this?
yeah. It's a very good question, because with one or two exceptions, I would say being big and deep pocketed and having invested in your IT and data in the past before ML and AI became a big thing was a direct indicator. So you could be top 20 without having done those things, in which case you wouldn't make it. But if you were, and let's take some real names, JP Morgan or BBVA, both of which are well known for their tech and data investments and leadership, yeah, you absolutely are on top, right? However, I have seen quite a few, not fintechs, by the way, not the digital banks, who frankly, in many cases, don't have enough data to do very, or didn't until generative AI at least. But I have seen specialist banks, and one that actually we met quite a bit and interacted with in Belgium, for example, KBC Bank. It's a relatively small bank. You would have heard of it, but not everybody else. Those who
Yeah.
are in the industry, they'll know.
Yeah. They do a lot of trade
But
finance stuff out here.
yeah, yeah. So fantastic focus on this, way ahead of many bigger companies, simply because they had a team that was relatively small and very clued in and well funded for that scale.
Right.
And because what they were doing was super important to the bank's overall strategy. But I would say those kinds are generally exceptions. If you are not big enough to spend a lot of money to not get access to Microsoft or Google with the latest models, etc., to not have the ability to attract a lot of engineers and data scientists, etc., it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
My next question, Shameek, sort of goes back to one of your points, but I want to go to the pre Gen AI world, or at
Mm.
least in terms of what normal people
Yep.
like us would know that. So before like 18 months ago.
Yep.
Um, so explainability is a buzzword that gets thrown around at all the conferences, and obviously it's core to what you were trying to do in your startup life. Um, walk me through briefly, because my understanding is that with neural networks, explainability gets very difficult. Uh, Essentially, everything is working off of big data, which is all about correlations, not causations. And therefore, uh, the more layers, the more neural layers you have, the murkier it gets. So you're basically just trying to figure out a bunch of correlations, all these inputs that somehow tend to come out with this other output. But of course, if you are on the receiving end of that output and you've been denied a loan, is it because of your financials? Is it because of the color of your skin? Is it because somebody look, it's hard to say. So just walk us through pre-generative AI, issues of explainability. How well could we address those? And is it mission impossible and we just have to come up with a spin for that, is there real progress being made?
So again, with that caveat of pre-gen AI, which is predictive AI in financial services. By the way, predictive AI in financial services didn't use a lot of deep neural network. The vast
Mhm.
majority of models was, gradient boosted models kind of stuff. So relatively simpler models. It was not a problem. And it
Okay.
was one of the reasons why we pivoted our business model very early from making your models explainable. It started off with, we'll make your black box explainable. But two things became clear. One, there were open source tools out there which did a half decent job of
Mhm.
managing the same thing. It's more a commercial point for us. But the second thing is, with the exception of particularly the US, where there's a lot of history, as you know, about making around fairness, around prevention of discrimination, around giving adequate information. With the exception of that market, which of course is a big market, it wasn't obvious that there were a lot of people clamoring for in financial services. Very different from your CV getting rejected, etc. That's different.
Right.
But in financial services, which is what your focus area is on, I actually did not see, I did see explainability as a requirement, but not enough as like cannot be solved kind of problem. It was a problem that could be solved. And I've spoken with regulators in multiple places. And regulators have been comfortable with the kinds of explainability techniques that existed, particularly if you are not using deep neural networks, particularly if you're not using deep neural networks.
And if you were,
Well, so the if you were part, first thing was people would often say, I mean, there was no like explicit guidance from regulators, but people would often use it to find um, like a simpler model eventually that does the job. They might use it for R&D, etc., but eventually you use something simpler. But of course, this thing broke down. I know you asked explicitly for pre-Gen AI, but with Gen AI,
well, of course,
this
we're going to
breaks
get into
down.
that. So let's
Yeah,
just dive right in. What's
yeah.
happening?
No, but I think there is a link, particularly if you take the regulatory position, because I did comment on this specifically on LinkedIn, but also I reconfirmed this with somebody in the Bank of England. The Bank of England in particular went specific a few months ago in their clarification saying, I mean, they didn't say explainability is not important, but they implied that with the right level of risk management, they will not insist from a PRA/POE perspective, they will not insist on that. Now, the FCA might, or the conduct side might, and there are situations where that is needed. That is much more
Right.
consumer facing. But this thing about everything must be explainable, I think people have given up on that, certainly with deep neural networks in generative AI situations. So now the focus has been much more on how well can you be, how confident can you be about the reliability of this system, which is much more about testing the overall stability, robustness, accuracy over time, rather than can you explain everything that's been happening. So that's been the journey that I've seen. And yes, indeed, um, there is something in the Bank of England's response to the UK digital ministry or whatever it is on, there was a consultation from the ministry to the major regulators saying, are you ready? And they basically said, we don't need new regulation. We think we're good with whatever we have. And explicitly, explainability is not an issue.
What's been the impact of Gen AI on all of these AI businesses?
When you say AI businesses, do you mean the shovel makers or uh, the
Yeah, I mean,
application?
well, companies like TruEra that were there to help
Okay.
companies,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
guess either in terms of banks or other institutions using AI tools,
Mm.
which have been around for a long time now,
Yep.
or the fintechs that have been selling those tools or services on top to these
Yep.
institutions. Along comes Gen AI,
Mm.
and obviously it's a huge talking point. Everyone's interested in it, and I think that's because it is inherently relatable to ordinary people.
Yep.
You can have a conversation with this computer. It might be making stuff up, but it's still a good conversation. So uh, I'd be curious what I really want to lead into, but maybe we have to take a little detour to get there. Is really with the serious deployment of these tools, because one hears on the one hand everyone's getting ready and it's going to be huge changes, and then one also hears that this thing is a lot of hype and it's deeply flawed and we're a long way. So I think a lot of people would be curious about kind of how to read this situation. And I think one way to try to get there is to first understand the impact that Gen AI has had on, let's call it, the finance AI industry.
Sure. Um, so so let's break that down into sorry, not break that. Let me take three examples, and two of them will be disguised. One will be TruEra's own. Um, so one of them is a major bank. How did Gen AI change things? I think Gen AI, in some ways, took something that was relatively maturing. So there was good stability on what AI or predictive AI does. People understood it. It's a mature organization. People understood roughly what it can do. There were a bunch of use cases, 700 plus models, several hundred or even thousand data scientists. Good focus on the technology and the practices and the governance needed to make that reliable. From that, it all went up in the air
Mhm.
because all of that investment, all of that focus, like everybody moved to Gen AI. So from the board down, something that people had left to the geeks, if you will, or to the more tech-aware business folks, suddenly became wide apart. So what did that mean? In practice, it meant, frankly, a little bit of disruption to their current AI journey. But in the longer run, it's good for them because they're now finally getting from you go away and do stuff in your own corner. And if I'm enlightened, I'll give you enough money to do it. But otherwise, you don't matter to me. Two, it's become much more mainstream. But as a result, there are far too many people wanting to have a say. Everybody wants to, in the organization, wants to do Gen AI. There's way too many vendors out there, the big vendors, the small ones, etc. So I would say a little bit of confusion is the most immediate
Yeah.
impact. But more medium term to long term, I think it's good, right? So that's the bank's perspective. And we can come back to the level of adoption in a minute. What are the use cases which are most mature and so on? If I take the second example, this is of a firm that has had AI in some form, natural language processing based software, for ages, at least 5, 6 years, which in AI world is ages, and had a pretty good business. I think 50 to $100 million ARR business, basically supporting banks and insurers and some non-financial companies do their back office work in a more automated fashion using NLP and a few other
Yes.
simple workflow. What changed for them was suddenly this thing that they thought was their IP and they built it, and that's why they had so many multi-million-dollar contracts. Everybody inside the banks and insurers started saying, we can do this now because suddenly Gen AI, of course, it's called generative AI, but of course, you can use it to do NLP much, much more effectively
Say
than
OCR,
before.
for example. or
Yeah. So
translation,
yeah, OCR translation, all of these kind of reading
or even
documents.
some coding.
Yeah, yeah. So even coding. So coding, this particular company wasn't that space. But to your point about fintechs who built upon, who provided software that used ML, actually for many of them, this has been a do or die moment. Everything that they were building suddenly been thrown up. Now, some have successfully made the pivot and they are now roaring back with much more power, but many others have basically lost, you know, just like some of the translation software might have lost their
Right.
reason for existence, like that has happened. Now, finally, for TruEra or for many of the other shovel makers, what did that mean? We absolutely had to shift from, hey, it looks like there's a well-formed market. We know where we are playing. Let's do all the right things to get this thing going to, oh, everything is there. So very practically, we moved from trying to sell big companies and get lots of revenues to getting users because nobody really knew what the end state technology for generative AI, I think it's called GenAI ops or whatever. Instead of ML ops, it's kind of, yeah, sorry, LLM ops, large
Right.
language
Yeah.
model ops.
Large language
Yeah.
models. Yeah.
Yeah. So we thought we knew everything about ML ops and suddenly LLM ops has come in. Actually, nobody knows where that will end. So we went much more into experimentation mode. And frankly, we had tremendous success on that. A large part of our final outcome is based on that because we had from a few hundred users to, I think when we finished, we were getting 2,500 new users a week, sorry, a day, 2,500 users a
So
day.
it's almost like I've been talking for years to companies as fintechs to start off B2C, and then they finally threw in the towel and went B2B. But it sounds like this has forced the opposite direction.
In the tooling world, yes, but actually more broadly. So this is an important point. The, my prediction for what it's worth for generative AI in financial services is that adoption will not be driven by top-down forces. Adoption will be driven because your customers and your employees will use it whether you like it or not.
Right.
If it was left top down, now your question of adoption, then necessarily somebody who's a senior management, sorry, what is it, SMR in the UK or equivalent elsewhere, they will not want to adopt it until they're 100% sure. It has to be at least as good as what we have. But if it's bottom up, as a customer, I might say, yeah, I know my agent might make some mistake. As long as some things are under control, I'm happy to let part of my financial services be managed by. And this is one of the biggest things that might happen now, intelligent agents representing you and me going and transacting on our behalf. So whether the bank likes it or not, whether the regulator likes it or not, there's a bunch of bots, if you will, that might be interacting with financial services firms. Same thing with employees. You can say as much as you want, you can't use ChatGPT at work, etc. You can't prevent the guy or girl from kind of typing the same thing onto their private terminal and getting it. So I think the big thing, you really did pick up on an important point. I think adoption might well be led by bottom up pressure. That bottom up is from employees and that bottom up is from customers. Of course, bottom up is not a good way of scaling up. Over time, you will need top down structures, tools,
Right. But the
governance,
initial
etc.
ideas will come more internally
And that is
and
exactly
more
what has happened.
organically. Yeah.
That is exactly what has happened.
And
Yeah.
that spells that's going to shake up the fintech world as well, because those fintechs that are focused on B2B sales might find that the banks or their staff can do at least part of what these people are selling just
Exactly.
themselves now, because you
Yep.
could just you can get a query done or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. So to take a very live example, everybody who's in the business of trying to make sales forces more productive, right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, the guy can take his own notes and come up with his conclusions. He doesn't need your sophisticated software where the data is dumped. He can just use his internal version of ChatGPT to say, let me dump all my notes from the last few days and ask what should I say today, as an example. Right?
Do you think this will filter into the way that people in your previous role, or the CTOs or CDOs that you used to work with, are they? Do you feel like they're rapidly changing to respond to this, or is it going to take a little while for the institutions to kind of get over their internal inertia?
I think it differs, to be very honest. I think if you are in a company that is already in that kind of mode of data is very important, automation is very important, we have lots of money put in to handle this thing properly. I mean, if you ask me what is the biggest single indicator, it's how seriously the organization took management of data.
Yeah,
If seriously means money, seriously means management support, etc., etc. If you did that, you're
you're
on
in
your
good
way.
shape.
right?
Yeah.
Now, individuals, even in other organizations, can be very well aware. To be honest, I've met many of my ex-peers, CDOs, CIOs, who are very aware. But whether they can move fast or not depends a little bit on how data-centric the organization was pre-ChatGPT.
Okay. What happened to TruEra? I mean, I understand it got sold, and sort of you're not there. So just give us a quick rundown on how this
Sure.
story ended.
Yeah, so yeah, our observability platform got acquired by Snowflake, who of course are in that data business, and a big part of their strategy is kind of, if you will, forward integration into being the partner of choice. Their thinking is, we hold all of your data if you're a customer of Snowflake. Why wouldn't you build your AI applications on top of us? And of course, they realized very early on that trustworthy AI is a big part. So we are now, or not we, TruEra as a platform is now part of their stack. But more broadly, and so that resulted in an exit. But more broadly, I think the reason that exit happened, and it's not just for us, for many companies in this space, is over time, buyers, B2B buyers, have got bewildered by the number of small vendors out there. So it's inevitable that either you're part of a partnership with some big companies or you're acquired as part of somebody else's. Surviving independently as one small part of the end-to-end MLOps chain is increasingly more and more difficult. So that's
Okay.
why the decision.
Yeah. So where does that leave you then? What's next for Shameek Kundu? Where do you want to go back into institutional world, another startup, big vendor? Where do you see this going for yourself?
Still deciding, but I think the main North Star will be I should do something because I'm interested in what that is and the effect it has, not because it is a startup or because it's an existing large organization. So probably purpose driven, to use the cliched word, but the purpose can be very personal. It doesn't have to be a world peace kind of purpose.
Okay. Well, Shameek, I think we'll leave it there. I mean, we've had a great discussion. Thank you for your insight. I think we've learned a lot about, from your perspective, of the key decisions that banks and other institutions are grappling with, the impact of Gen AI on both the fintechs and the institutions. And we got a little bit into weeds with understanding where this technology is going. So just want to say thank you for your time and look forward to learning what's going to be next for you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Really enjoyed the conversation.